There is a question that has been sitting quietly beneath the surface of ancient history for a very long time. Not just the question of where civilization began, but the question of who was truly behind it, and whether those figures were entirely what they appeared to be. What if the oldest written records humanity has ever produced contain something far stranger than anyone expected to find there? Something pressed into clay thousands of years ago by people who believed with complete sincerity that the authority to govern the earth had never truly belonged to ordinary men. Instead, they tell us very clearly that the beings who shaped the first great cities of ancient Sumer and the lineages that flowed through them were something deliberately set apart, vessels of a carefully managed genetic inheritance, carrying divine wisdom from the old world into the new, chosen not by accident, not by conquest, but by the deliberate hand of the gods themselves, weaving a careful and enduring design that stretched across flood and famine and the rise and fall of history's greatest and oldest kingdoms, across vast stretches of time. This isn't a story that begins and ends with a single dynasty or collapses when one empire falls. The thread that runs through these texts is older than almost anything we have a name for. Bloodlines that have long since been forgotten by most of the world, but were never left to chance. Bloodlines that were carefully watched, traced, cultivated across centuries with a precision that feels almost clinical when you stop to really look at the remnants they left behind. And it doesn't stop at the edge of the antediluvian world. It carries forward, through the waters of a great flood, through the rebuilding of civilization in its aftermath, through the courts of kings and the temple chambers of high priests, through deified mortals, semi-divine counselors, and the very children of the Anunnaki gods themselves. What the Sumerian tablets preserve is a picture of a world with a very specific kind of hierarchy, one that continued long after most people realize, intertwining law and reality in ways beyond imagination, and defying all conventional interpretation. And this isn't an idea buried in fringe theory or hidden in some obscure corner of someone's basement. At the core of it, we find hard evidence written directly into the oldest historical records humanity has ever produced, the first written records known to mankind, pressed into earthen hard rectangular tablets, using nothing more than clay and water and the curing hot rays of the Mesopotamian sun, carefully catalogued in long neat rows and stored in cool temple chambers by the very civilization that first taught the world what it meant to be civilized. And what is perhaps most striking is how consistent that picture remains, across centuries of cuneiform inscription, across different cities and different dynasties and different cultural moments. The same essential declarations surface again and again, that something celestial was woven into the foundations of human civilization from its very first breath, and that only certain people were ever meant to carry it forward. So, get comfortable. Let the familiar shapes around you soften and blur at the edges, because what we're moving through tonight are some of the oldest surviving records of something that the modern world is only beginning to find words for. A story of divine inheritance, of lineages that were never truly lost, of a celestial authority that did not end when the first great era of humanity came to a close, but was simply handed on, quietly, to those who came after. The Sumerians called it Nam Lugal, the supreme authority of kingship, and from the very beginning of their written tradition, they were explicit about where it came from. It did not emerge from military strength alone, or from wealth, or from the will of the people. It descended from heaven. That's the phrase they used, again and again, in texts separated by centuries. The kingship was lowered from the sky by the Anunnaki, the great gods of the Sumerian pantheon, and placed into the hands of specific individuals who were chosen to act as divine surrogates here on earth. This wasn't just a metaphor to them, it was administrative fact. It was the foundational logic of everything their society was built on, and everything that was yet to come. And when you understand that, the social architecture of the pre-flood world starts to come into better focus. There was an enormous gulf between the ordinary population and a far higher caste of divine representatives. Common people were created, according to Mesopotamian theology, to carry the physical and administrative burdens of the earth, to till the soil, maintain the canals, serve the temples. That was the explicit purpose assigned to them. But above them, governing not just politically, but cosmically, stood a line of primeval kings, whose nature the texts describe as fundamentally different, longer lived, set apart, operating as intermediaries between the human world and the divine one, with a mandate that stretched far beyond anything a normal human lifespan could contain. And the physical evidence for this is truly remarkable. But perhaps it is best summed up on a legendary artifact known as the Weld Blundell Prism, a four-sided clay column covered in cuneiform script. It can still be seen today, housed in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. It contains the Sumerian kings' list, and when you read it, the first thing that stops you cold is the sheer scale of the numbers. In the antediluvian era, the time before the Great Flood, the list names only 8 kings, 8 rulers across an era that the text claims stretched across more than 241,000 long years. The shortest reign listed runs to 18,600 years. The longest reaches over 40,000. To the ancients, these weren't viewed as errors or translation problems. They're presented with the same matter-of-fact tone as everything else found in their meticulous documentation, as if the scribes who recorded them found nothing unusual about them at all, suggesting that whatever these early sovereigns were understood to be, they were not ordinary mortals in the way we now know, but something more. And here's what becomes even more interesting when you pull the thread a little further. The Sumerian record doesn't just describe kings with extraordinary lifespans. It describes others beyond even the kings, who occupied a category that ordinary mortals simply had no access to. A select few who were endowed with a status that made them stand out among all the rest. Some who, after a long series of misadventures, even achieved the immortality of the gods themselves, elevated beyond death entirely. Some others who, strangely enough, were intentionally wiped from the history books, their records marked forbidden. And others still, who occupy a space in the crossover between history and mythology, a space that lies somewhere in between, far more tangible, yet still distinctly elevated, but all stemming from a time before the flood, serving the antediluvian kings as counselors, as teachers and priests and princes, and others whose presence was even harder to explain yet. All of them carrying advanced knowledge of ancient astronomy, agriculture, medicine, engineering, and more, ensuring that the sacred arts would survive the shifting tides of time, while occupying a level in the social and spiritual hierarchy that was reserved explicitly for those of a certain designation. And above it all rises one figure in particular, a man known mostly for the dangerous waters he defied, because the flood myth itself isn't simply a story about destruction, it's a story about selection, about one man, described pointedly as a priest of Enki, who was chosen to save all others, who survived the unsurvivable and then accomplished the impossible while the world was rebuilt around him. What was salvaged from those waters wasn't random, it was curated, a carefully preserved continuation of the same divine inheritance that existed before it. But why? What were these lineages created for before the sky turned dark and the waters rose? And if these bloodlines were real enough for the Sumerians to document with such consistency and precision across thousands of years of administrative records, where exactly did they all go? Perhaps they were never truly erased. Perhaps what we are witnessing is the oldest surviving records of lineages that were not lost, so much as hidden, concealed by people who, across the rise and fall of empires yet to come, chose to keep certain inheritances quiet, lineages that were deliberately obscured from memory, and who may, in ways we have yet to fully understand, still move through the world to this day. If you are listening to this in the quiet of night, let us know where and when you are joining us from, in the comments section below. It is quietly comforting to realize that listeners across distant lands and different time zones are all settling into the same quiet journey through the forgotten echoes of human history. If you enjoy this History for Sleep narrative, consider subscribing to the channel, or join the Legends of the Dawn membership for uninterrupted narratives. Your support helps our efforts to keep bringing you these ancient stories each week and continue reaching others who are searching for the same calm place to relax and unwind. So if your eyes feel heavy, let them fall closed slowly, softly, and let everything that defines the space around you gently fall away. The air grows softer, light falls dimmer, and the familiar shapes of the world as you know it begin to blur at the edges, giving way to the warm glow of countless hearth fires flickering in the distance. Packed earth and baked mud bricks from the first great ziggurats rise slowly from the marshy floodplains, their terraced steps catching the last of the luminous beams emanating from the moon. The air smells of reeds and river water, because not so far in the distance the Tigris and Euphrates run wide and dark to the east. The delta stretches on forever in every direction. The southern seas of the Persian Gulf glisten and ebb and flow with the tides. And somewhere at the edge of all of it, something strange is already set in motion, something that was set in place long before the flood came and did not entirely end, when the waters finally receded. There, drifting through the early morning fog that rises off the damp soil, the great city of Eridu begins to take shape, one of the oldest cities on Earth, a place the Sumerians believed was the very birthplace of organized civilization, the point from which all order first spread outward, across the flat southern plains. And it is here, according to the tablets, that something monumental occurred. This was where kingship first ascended, not gradually, not through any slow accumulation of power, but in a single decisive moment, as if a switch had been thrown somewhere in the heavens above. The Sumerian king list records it with the same calm certainty it uses to record everything else. Kingship was lowered from the sky, and the first man to hold it was Alulim of Eridu, the first sovereign of the antediluvian world, said to have ruled for a staggering 28,800 years. The tablets do not apologize for that number, they offer it plainly. And that plainness, that complete absence of hesitation, is itself worth sitting with for a moment. Because the Sumerians were not describing a man who simply rose through the ranks. They were describing a divine vessel, selected by the hands of the highest Anunnaki gods. A carefully prepared, specific human form through whom something far larger than any one single individual could flow. Lugal, the divine kingship, was a sacred institution, and when it arrived in Eridu, it arrived not as an abstract idea, but as something almost physical in its weight, and in consequence. Something that had to be housed in the right body, carried by the right blood, and maintained by the right rituals, with rigid discipline. The city itself would have been extraordinary to witness. Mud brick towers rising from thick reed beds, the first great temple mounds climbing toward a sky still thick with stars as the day began to brighten. And at the center of all of it, a throne that meant far more than any throne we have a word for today. And watching from somewhere above all of this was the supreme Anunnaki triad, Anu, the sky god and father of the divine order, Enlil, who held authority over wind and storm and the fate of nations, and Enki, lord of the deep freshwater realm called the Apsu, god of wisdom and creation and the careful management of all living things. These three oversaw an intricate structure that was layered and deliberate. Kings at the top of the earthly hierarchy were not selected by any council of ordinary men. They were not chosen by their deeds or by popular will. They were, in the framework the tablets describe, biologically and ritually prepared conduits to the spiritual realms. Specific individuals, whose bloodlines had been curated to serve as living bridges between the celestial council and the mortal world below. It was a system of extraordinary precision. And the kings, for all their divine preparation, would not be expected to carry that weight alone. The gods knew that such a tremendous task required equally tremendous wisdom. Our minds had already been crafted to absorb such knowledge, but without direct intervention, it would take far too long to develop such a vast understanding on its own. And so, they sent the Apkallu, the original 7 sages, who were not just ushered into the world at random, but created directly by the wise water god Enki, specifically to fill the gap. He who was said to have created our own species with the finest clay of the Apsu and the immortal blood of one of their own, had also created the divine emissaries who would guide us through our earliest days. These were beings who were not born of woman nor of earth, but formed directly by Enki's will, using his infinite knowledge of esoteric magic through incantations that have since been lost to time. Creatures that were immortal demigods, described as being semi-divine and fully otherworldly, emerging, according to the ancient descriptions, from the freshwater depths of the Apsu itself, one bright and misty morning, clad in the shimmering skins of enormous sacred fish, their long cloaks catching and holding the light of glistening water droplets still clinging to their scales, shimmering in the warm sun as they stepped forward. You can find them depicted in the great carved stone reliefs of Mesopotamia. Strange figures, half fish, half man, carrying ceremonial buckets and pine cones, standing shoulder to shoulder with the ancient Sumerian kings. And through something called the Uruk list of kings and sages, we can see that each of these 7 beings was paired with a specific sovereign, a dedicated relationship, a chain of transmission meant to echo in eternity. And at the core of both of their missions was the task of delivering the Holy May, the fundamental parameters and blueprints of all civilization itself, containing within it everything anyone could ever possibly need to grow and sustain a truly advanced society. And there, in those deep, resonant voices that were said to echo the patient movement of calm ocean tides, the Apkallu taught the earliest kings and high priests the principles of mathematics, the proportions of sacred architecture, the foundations of medicine and law, and the careful reading of the stars turning silently overhead. They are, genuinely, some of the most mysterious figures in all of Mesopotamian lore, not only because of what they were or how they were portrayed, but because of how long their memory lasted. They surface again and again across the centuries, under different names, appearing in different cultures, carrying the same essential role through traditions around the world. But most people who spend even a little time with Sumerian material already know these figures. The king list is, after all, one of the most widely studied artifacts in all of ancient Mesopotamian history. But here is where it gets genuinely interesting, because beyond the kings and the sages and the gods themselves, the oldest records carry reference to other figures entirely. Figures who hold a distinct and separate designation. Figures who don't follow the usual path, some of whom were remembered with unease, and some of whom they seem to have tried very, very hard to make sure no one would ever remember again. Which brings us to something that even the texts themselves seem reluctant to say out loud, because scattered across various excavation sites in Iraq, tucked into climate-controlled storage rooms in museums most people will never visit, there exists a particular category of artifact, one that carries a designation unlike anything else in the archaeological record. Researchers working through ancient archives in the 18th and 19th centuries kept encountering the same strange instruction pressed in cuneiform script on certain tablets, Nissi Tuppi, translating roughly to the secret of the tablet, not to be shown to the uninitiated. These weren't the kinds of ordinary records we were used to encountering. They weren't administrative lists, or agricultural tallies, or royal proclamations. They were marked as restricted, set apart, reserved only for the eyes of the highest-ranking priests, who by later periods were, themselves, deeply entangled in the political machinery of their own rising empires. Men whose loyalty was owed not just to the gods they served, but to the kings who paid for the temples they served them in, which raises an obvious question. What exactly were they hiding? There is a tablet that most people have never heard of, found in the ruins of the ancient city of Assur, and it sits today in fragmented condition, damaged enough that scholars have spent decades debating how to read it. It's called Kar-4, a bilingual tablet written in both Sumerian and Akkadian, suggesting it was considered important enough to be preserved across two languages and two distinct cultural traditions. And what it describes, much to our amazement, is an entirely separate creation event, one that takes all the way back to our first breath, not the same standard account, not the one most people encounter when they first start reading about Mesopotamian mythology, but something different, something that provides a new perspective that the more familiar records quietly leave out. Kar-4 maintains that humanity was formed from clay and the divine blood of a sacrificed god. That part isn't what's unusual. What is unusual is what comes next. The tablet directly names the first two human creations, the first mortal beings to walk the face of planet Earth. It calls them Uligara and Anagara, and that act of naming in the context of Mesopotamian records carried a far greater weight than most people realize at first. Because the seemingly simple act of naming in these traditions was far more than just an act of identification. It was also a mark of standing, a signal of status, and the general human laborer class, what the early texts called the Lulu, weren't given individual titles like this. They were created as a workforce, a sort of conglomerate that was identified as a whole, rather than any individual part, much like the Igigi, the lesser divine gods we were said to have been created to replace. But Uligara and Anagara were something else entirely, something the scribes felt compelled to distinguish, which suggests, at least to the scholars who have spent enough time with this material, that the ancient record keepers may have been tracking two separate lineages in the world before the flood, one broad and undifferentiated, the other specific, named and apparently guided directly by Enki himself. And then they hid it. Later scribal institutions, working centuries after these original accounts were first composed, appear to have folded these two populations into a single, much simpler story. This distinct lineage was quietly absorbed into the general narrative, the names curiously missing, the distinction erased, and what traces they left behind were marked by the Nissi Tuppi, kept from public access and hidden from sight. And maybe the reasoning behind it isn't so hard to understand, because when you look further back through time, you realize that the gods had already watched the Igigi, their own worker class of lesser deities, rebel and overthrow the order that had been built above them. Now, the humans created to replace them were clearly understood as a species that required guidance not to become unruly. And if ordinary human laborers were already capable of posing that kind of challenge to divine authority, then a lineage imbued with higher power and guided by the most clever of the gods would have certainly represented a far more unsettling threat, one fully capable of overturning the sovereign order that the Anunnaki had worked so hard to put into place. At the end of the day, whether it was the human scribes who buried this knowledge to protect existing power structures, or whether the concealment was directed from something above them entirely, that is a question the tablets don't cleanly answer, and perhaps that ambiguity is the point. But in any case, their attempt to hide our origins did not deter mankind from flourishing. The antediluvian era, that long and almost incomprehensible stretch of time before the flood, was not a quiet age. It was a flourishing one, and the texts trace every step as they spread rapidly across each of the 5 primeval cities of ancient Sumer, each successor carrying the celestial mandate of kingship forward, like a torch passed through generations that spanned far longer than we can easily imagine. From Eridu in the primordial marshes, where fresh water met the salty seas at the edge of the known world, the mandate eventually moved to Bad Tibira, a city of a different character entirely. Where Eridu smelled of river mud and sacred water, Bad Tibira was a place of forges and fields, of copper being worked by firelight, grain being measured in temple storerooms, and the hum of organized labor filling streets that stretched to the horizon. After Bad Tibira came Larak, quieter but no less ancient, a city shaded by groves of date palms and threaded through with irrigation canals that turned the surrounding land impossibly green. And then, from there, the mandate reached Sipar, the solar city, a place that fell under the domain of Shamash, otherwise known as Utu, the sun god whose light was understood not just as life-giving warmth, but as truth itself. These were not the humble settlements of a society struggling to find their footing in the dark. They were capitals, in the fullest sense of the word, places where kings whose reigns lasted tens of thousands of years maintained what the tablets describe as a perfect cosmic alignment, a carefully sustained harmony between the divine order above and the human world below. But it is in Sipar, specifically, where something else begins to emerge, something that the tablets treat as an elevated class unto itself. Not the king, and not one of the original 7 Apkallu Sages, those mysterious fish-cloaked figures who had carried divine knowledge up from the deep, but from another lineage, one defined by this city in particular, because here came a third kind of elevated being, scribes and seers of the highest possible order, dedicated priests the Sumerians called the Baru. Now make no mistake, revered scribes were not a new concept to the old world, even at this point. But here the Baru stand out with particular distinction, second only to the king and the sages themselves. And what set them apart was not just rank, it was the nature of what they knew, and how they had come to know it. Because according to the traditions, the seventh king of the Sipar, King Enmeduranki, had been directly chosen to ascend from his throne, rising up into the heavens alongside his Apkallu companion named Utu Abzu, the last of the original 7 sages to ever be seen before the flood. And there, in the luminous assembly hall of the gods, they stood before the presence of the Anunnaki themselves, making direct contact with Shamash of the sun and Adad the storm god. And what those 2 deities gave him wasn't simply a blessing or even protection. It was knowledge, the arts of divination, higher advanced mathematics, the reading of celestial patterns, and the interpretation of omens that most mortals would never be permitted to approach. And when their sovereign lord returned, he gave that same divine knowledge to the Baru priests, who carried the teachings of the gods forward with extraordinary care. Night after night they climbed to the highest temple platforms to read the movements of stars, the omens that lay therein, and divining secret messages hidden in swirling patterns of pure iridescent oils spilled over clear water. This knowledge wasn't second-hand. It hadn't been filtered through generations of human interpretation and speculation. According to the Sumerians, it had come directly from the Anunnaki gods, passed down through Enmeduranki, and preserved by these priests with an almost impossible degree of fidelity. Unlike the administrative roles that would appear in later, post-flood civilizations, the antediluvian Baru weren't looking through the lens of a diluted religion. They were custodians of something the gods themselves had personally handed over, and they functioned at the very edge of what a mortal mind was thought to be capable of holding. Said to enter deep trance-like states of contemplation, operating with unwavering focus as an elite and elevated class, one that was integral in maintaining the kingdom's cosmic balance. An entire group of ancient custodians that stood shoulder by shoulder alongside the long-lived monarchs and immortal fish-cloaked sages of old, patiently and tirelessly keeping everything in its rightful place, and constantly keeping vigil over the turning of the night sky. And together they would take ancient Sumer to heights it had never before experienced. In its final centuries, their world had reached something genuinely remarkable. All of those interlocking systems had built a civilization that functioned with the kind of precision that is genuinely difficult to fully picture from where we stand now. At the center of it all sat Shuruppak, the 5th and last great capital of the antediluvian era, ruled by a king named Ubra-Tutu, and watched over closely by his son, the deeply pious Prince Ziusudra. Side by side, they presided over whitewashed temple observatories that rose above groves of emerald palms, and over vast irrigation networks laid out in careful geometric patterns across the floodplains. The granaries were full, the canals ran clean and purposeful. Agricultural yields were, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary, and the divine patronage of the gods, carefully tended and consistently honored, seemed to hold the whole structure upright. It was, in the truest sense the tablets would allow, a golden age. But it was also a system that had begun to strain under the weight of its own success, and that tension is where things start to shift, because the pre-flood world wasn't just growing at a steady rate, not slowly and not quietly. After the teachings of Sipar, mortal humans were multiplying across the Mesopotamian plains at an unprecedented pace. The streets of the great cities were becoming congested. The canals, once carefully maintained, were growing choked. Granaries overflowed. Their resources were still many, but the infrastructure which held it all together was beginning to burst at the seams. Feel the pressure of so many mouths so many seasons, so many generations pressing against the limits of what the land could hold. And this expansion, this sheer volume of human life and noise, had begun to trouble the high god Enlil, the lord of raging winds and tempest storms, he who had ushered the first breath of air into the world. The clamour of humanity was something that genuinely disturbed him, a rising roar of human activity that never stopped, never paused for rest, a ringing that carried upward and outward all at once, and that Enlil found increasingly intolerable. The population wasn't merely growing, it was, in his estimation, becoming something disorderly, something that threatened the balance the gods had so carefully established. Their restless ambition was creating a clamour capable of shaking the very pillars of heaven. A disturbance that is, perhaps best illustrated in one particular story, because to better understand what that loss of balance actually looked like at the human level, the tablets offer us something unexpected. Not a king, not a sage or a seer, a man named Tagtug, an artisan and weaver, a man whose story is set not in the crowded plains of late Shuruppak, but in an older and much more pristine place, the sacred land of Dilmun, the Garden of the Gods, a place described in the Sumerian sources as clean and bright and free from all sickness, where the laws of mortality had not yet taken hold. In this particular interpretation of the law, Tagtug lived there quietly, tending the land, working with his hands, dwelling inside a kind of original peace that the later world had clearly already lost, and for a time that was enough. But Tagtug was inherently curious, and that curiosity, unchecked, drove him to do the one thing he had been forbidden from. The gods had warned him, explicitly, to leave the sacred healing plants alone. These plants, often linked in scholarly readings to something like cassia, carried a kind of divine potency that mortal hands were not supposed to disturb. But Tagtug ignored that warning. He picked from them, he ate. And that single act, driven not by malice but by something as ordinary as the simple desire to know what was unknown, changed everything. What followed was swift and severe. The goddess Ninhursag, a figure of profound creative power, turned that power into a curse. And so Tagtug was struck with sickness, not just the ordinary illness of an aging body, but something that cut against his fundamental nature. The pristine state he had inhabited, the long life near to immortality, the balance, the immunity from the kinds of suffering that would later define mortal existence, all of it collapsed. And that collapse, the tablets suggest, was a marker, a warning, a signal of what unchecked human curiosity and overreach could cost, not only to an individual, but to an entire order. That sequence, from a single transgression to Ninhursag's curse, and the shift from original wholeness to fragile mortal life, sits in the tablets as something like a prelude of what was to come. Human overreach had demonstrated its consequences at the individual scale, and now, across the flooding plains of Shuruppak, it was demonstrating them on a civilizational scale. And all the while Enlil was watching, the clamour was growing louder, and the gods were beginning, quietly, to make new plans of their own, because that flawed act of curiosity formed just one part of a continuous sequence of early history, reflecting the restless ambition that ultimately justified Enlil's decision to wipe the earthly slate clean. But not every god agreed with what was coming. Enlil had made his decision, and the assembly had heard it. The floodwaters would fall. The earth would be scoured. Whatever noise humanity had made, whatever restless ambition had accumulated across those long antediluvian reigns, would be silenced beneath the water. Most of the gods accepted this. Enlil's power was undisputed among the council, and so they stepped back. They watched. But Enki, the god of wisdom and of the deep freshwater ocean beneath the earth, the one who had shaped human clay with his own design, would not simply wait to see his brother bring the world unto destruction. He had watched humanity since the very beginning. He understood that we had become a necessary element, and it seems, from the way the tablets read, he seemed to already know exactly whose help he needed to save it. Ziusudra was not an ordinary man chosen by accident of timing. He was the son of the last divine king of Shuruppak, and the final ruler listed before the Great Break in the king's list. Before the flood changed everything, his lineage was one that had inherited the most vast wisdom they had ever accumulated before, running back through the chain of antediluvian sovereigns, stretching across tens of thousands of years, and the same divine thread that had been woven into those first kings, those figures who stood somewhere between mortal and immortal, ran through him just the same. But what separated Ziusudra from the people around him was more than blood. It was what he did with his divine inheritance. The tablets describe him as genuinely humble. He listened. Where others had turned inward toward personal whims or earthly comfort, Ziusudra kept his attention directed outward and upward, toward the heavenly frequencies of the gods. He practiced ritual compliance not as obligation, but as something closer to total devotion. He read the cosmic signs that his neighbors walked past without a glance, and saw in them celestial messages, like the silent whispers of a lost tongue, a hidden language that most ordinary men would never know. That made him rare, and so it was he who Enki went to, a man who, by all accounts, preserved in the Eridu Genesis, valued the continuation of life and of knowledge above all else, a man sensitive enough to hear his call. So Enki moved carefully. He had sworn alongside the other gods not to warn humanity. The oath was binding, but Enki was also the god of cleverness, and he devised an equally clever solution. He did not technically speak to Ziusudra directly. Instead, he whispered to the wall. The texts describe Enki standing outside the reed chamber where the prince slept, speaking as though he was pressing his words into the material of the wall itself, trusting that a man trained in deep listening would hear what passed through, even when it carried no obvious voice. The message was urgent and specific. Tear down your house, use the timber, build a vessel large and sealed with bitumen, strong enough to carry the seed of all living things across whatever waters are coming. Then take everything you know, every piece of accumulated wisdom your civilization has gathered, and bury it. Carry it to Separ, the solar city, and place it in the archives under the protection of Shamash, the sun god, so that when the waters recede, the knowledge won't have drowned with everything else. There, he said, it would wait in the dark embrace of the earth until the sun could find it again. And so they did exactly that. The tablets suggest a period of urgent, quiet preparation in the final stretch before the rain, while the wider population continued through their ordinary days. The inner circle of the antediluvian world, the kings and their advisers, the Baru seers who had spent generations reading omens and celestial patterns, they now all moved through the temple archives with a different purpose. They worked in the Eduba, the house of tablets, rushing to press everything that mattered into wet clay, while gathering and organizing the catalogues they had already long since completed. Precise astronomical measurements, complex mathematical sequences, long records of lineages that traced the divine bloodlines, all the way back to their origins, ritual interpretations that had taken centuries to develop. All of it was pressed into earthen tablets by people who understood that the information itself was the inheritance worth protecting, and then it was carefully carried to Sippar and buried, hidden from the flood, left for whoever came after. And while the priests worked in those dark temple rooms, Ziusudra worked outside with his craftsmen. And when the work was done and the ark was ready, he did not board the vessel alone. He brought his wife. Some texts indicate he even brought his own children. And with them, he brought a guild of master craftsmen, artisans who carried in their hands and their memory the practical knowledge of the pre-flood world, the sacred craft wisdom that the Sumerians called the May, the divine instructions that governed civilization, metalworking, construction, textile production, the management of complex systems, and more. These were not random survivors. They were selected for what they knew and what they could rebuild. And then came the rain, and it must have been a sight to behold. A large vessel, sealed and heavy, lifting off a disappearing shoreline, a circular arc coated in dark bitumen, rising on waters that had no horizon anymore. The borderlines between the dark, swirling ocean tides and the tempest raining down from above all blurred together. For 7 days and 7 nights the storm raged on, and all the while, inside the flood hero's circular craft was a compressed version of everything the antediluvian world had once been. A bloodline that stretched back to the first kings, the crafts that had built the first cities, and a man who had been directly communicating with the gods since he was a boy. One man, carrying the last pure strains of the pre-flood world safely across the waters, while the old world was systematically erased below, washed clean. But all storms pass, and when the 7th day finally broke, the storm fell silent, not gradually, not with a slow tapering of wind and rain, just silence, arriving all at once, the way silence always feels louder than the thing that came before it. The clouds pulled apart, and through the gaps the first pale light of a calmer sky began to wash down over a world that had been completely remade. The great ark, heavy and dark with pitch, drifted slowly across what had become a featureless inland sea. No cities, no shorelines, no roads, on fragmented ruins left beneath the surface to anchor any memory of the world that had been there just a week before. And then, somewhere in that stillness, the hull scraped against rock. The ark had come to rest on the craggy, uneven peaks of Mount Nimush. High ground, the only ground there was. Above the flood hero's circular craft, the sky was settling into something deep and quiet, a wash of dark indigo bleeding slowly into the first soft traces of starlight. It was the kind of silence that follows total destruction, and it must have felt, to the man inside, like waking up inside a world that still hadn't decided what it was going to be. What happened next, the tablets tell us, was not immediately dramatic. Works like the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Babylonian traditions of Berossus tell of birds that were sent out to test the waters at first. A swallow that returned, a raven that didn't, the slow confirmation measured in small wind beats that somewhere dry land was beginning to emerge again. And when the flood hero finally stepped out of the ark and onto the mountain peak, his first act was not to survey the damage. It was to build an altar, to arrange cedar wood and sweet cane and branches of myrtle, and to set them alight on the highest point of the mountain. The smoke rose straight up into still air, fragrant, thin, unmistakably alive against a sky that had, until recently, held nothing but chaos. It was an offering, an announcement, a signal sent upward to wherever the gods had retreated, while the waters did their work. And soon enough, the gods gathered around that smoke like flies, driven by hunger. They had watched the rain do what it was intended to, and somewhere in that watching, they had grown thin on the absence of human devotion. The sacrifices, the grain offerings, the rituals that fed the gods had all stopped when the last city went under. And now, rising from a mountain peak above a drowned world, came the first fragrant smoke in 7 days. It was one of the quiet arguments Enki used to push back against Enlil's more complete vision of human erasure. People were not just problems to be managed. The gods could not rule and maintain the earth at the same time. They needed stewards. They needed the labor, the ritual, the devotion that only a human civilization could provide. And standing there on that mountain, smelling the cedar smoke rising from the altar, a pillar of dedication built by a man who had survived only because Enki had chosen him to survive, even Enlil could not argue with the evidence. So slowly he found his anger dissolving into what the texts describe as something closer to awe. He took the flood hero and his wife by the hand. He led them both to kneel on the peak of the mountain, and then, touching their foreheads, he spoke a blessing over them, and breathed into their lungs something the tablets call celestial life. From this moment forward, they would not age, they would not sicken, they would not die as mortals die. They had passed through the flood as humans, but they were rising from it as something else entirely. Two former mortals, elevated by the hand of the god who had ordered the flood in the first place, now declared to be gods themselves. The immortal pair were then carried across the cosmic waters to dwell in permanent rest as the living keepers of everything the antediluvian world had been, to the glorious city of the gods, a city called Dilmun. They were not erased. They were preserved in the most complete sense imaginable. To this day, the name of the flood hero shifts depending on which culture preserved the memory. Ziusudra in the oldest Sumerian texts, Atrahasis in the Akkadian version, meaning exceedingly wise, Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where a very old man sits at the edge of the world and tells a grieving king that immortality is not what he thinks it is. Different names, different details around the edges, but the same essential figure at the center, a man chosen by a god, preserved through catastrophe and transformed by what he survived. His memory carried forward across thousands of years, through languages that replaced each other, through empires that erased the ones before them, through every retelling that added something and lost something along the way, and yet still holds the familiar shape of the original. The generations that came after him went on to repopulate and rebuild, and somewhere down along the line, through different perspectives from different cultures and religions, we see the figures of his direct descendants arising in history. A family that survived a catastrophe that defined an entire era and left a permanent impression in the ground that we can still see. And through all of them, something of the antediluvian world continued, the knowledge, the bloodlines, the memory of what had existed before the rain. Whatever divine quality the gods had placed into those earliest lineages, it did not simply end at the waterline. Because these were figures that carried forward through Sumer, through Babylon, through every civilization that came after, all while reaching back to something far older, carrying the divine spark of the antediluvian age through the endless currents of time, forming, perhaps, the long-forgotten roots of bloodlines that are still walking among us to this very day. And so the earth recovered, not all at once, but slowly, the rivers found their old channels again. The mud dried into cracked pale earth beneath a returning sun. And somewhere in the quiet aftermath of all that had broken and been remade, people began the patient task of living once again. They gathered reeds from the riverbank. They shaped clay with their hands. They laid the first courses of new walls in new places, and placed some right over the old, working without urgency, the way one moves when the storm has already passed, and there is simply the long, unfolding remainder of life waiting ahead. And all that knowledge that had been carried forward was still there, intact, held carefully inside certain minds, and certain lineages, and certain archives, the way a seed holds everything it needs before the conditions are right. And the conditions were becoming right again, the way they always do. What came after was altered, different than what came before, yet still just as striking. The gods may have changed the rules for all of creation, but their influence did not wane. And beneath it all, mankind flourished. Through the ordinary, unremarkable miracle of people simply waking up each morning and choosing to build something, to plant something new, to teach a child the name of a star. The cities that rose in the centuries following the flood did so with equal dedication, and soon enough those first settlements started to grow faster and faster. One dwelling at a time, one season of grain at a time, until one day there was a street where there had once been only a path, a wall where there had been open ground. And in the courtyards of those early settlements, in the long hour before full dark, hearth fires would glow amber and low, casting slow shadows along clay walls that were still warm from the day's heat. The air would settle. The river would move in its constant quiet rhythm, not far off, carrying its cool breath across the flatlands. And above all of it, unchanged and eternal, the stars would appear one by one in the darkening sky, the same stars that earlier eyes had already mapped, and named, and built entire systems of meaning around. Generations from countless ages passing beneath the same fixed points of light, a grandmother showing a child how to find a particular constellation. That child, grown old, doing the same for another small hand, pointing upward into the dark. The knowledge moving forward endlessly, just like the rotating stars overhead. Not through tablets alone, but through the simple, unhurried transfer of attention, as though to simply say, "Look there. Do you see it? Do you see what lies beneath?" And with enough patience they did see. They saw how the world kept turning in that slow, reliable way it has always turned. And the people in it kept doing what people have always done, looking up and wondering and carrying what they discovered into the next morning. There is no rush in any of that. There doesn't need to be. The stars are patient. The river is patient. And somewhere beneath the sound of your own breathing, beneath whatever remnants the day has left behind, there is that same unhurried current moving through everything we know, everything we see, and everything we are, carrying us just as it carried them through the long, still landscape of the night. And there the weight of consciousness grows lighter. The distances between the realms widen. The expanse of the night sky is full and soft and very old. For it has been watching over those who slumber for longer than memory can reach. And just like our ancestors before us, we are all held in that same silent comfort, drifting into it slowly, gently, sinking further and further still into the deep and untroubled space between the turning stars. And so, as the turning stars held that primeval earth in silent comfort, the quiet sky continued to watch over a world that was slowly finding its new footing. Those waters had left behind a vast, transformed landscape that was peaceful, patient, and full of quiet potential. For a long while, the land lay open and waiting under the soft ancient starlight, suspended in an ethereal pause between the vanished world before the flood and the rising dawn of whatever was destined to come next. Across those vast, drying river valleys, a gentle and unhurried rhythm began to take root in the stillness. It was a time of quiet transition, where the lingering whispers of lost antediluvian ages met the soft, tentative breath of a brand new dawn. The world did not rush to reclaim its former glory, nor did it forget the monumental shifts that had fundamentally reshaped the cosmos. Instead, the heavy silence of the night sky seemed to cradle the lingering echoes of lost kingdoms, keeping safe the deep, sacred mysteries that lay beneath the surface of the earth, waiting quietly for the right hour to stir once again. And in that still, untroubled space between the celestial spheres, the cosmic threads of mandate and destiny remained fully intact, glowing faintly like hidden coals beneath the cool ashes of the past. The grand, magnificent design had not simply ended at the waterline, it had merely paused to settle into the very soil, resting deeply alongside the forgotten knowledge held within those silent, hidden archives. And when the shadows of the fading darkness gradually softened into the pale copper light of morning, the atmosphere shifted, thick with a subtle magnetic sense of anticipation. Something profound was stirring just beyond the horizon, ready to emerge from the quiet mist of deep antiquity. The lingering celestial spark was preparing to ignite once more, moving forward to reshape the earth and initiate a new extraordinary era of human history, leaving us to question. When the primeval waters finally receded, and the grandest cities of deep antiquity rose from the dust, did the Anunnaki gods simply abandon their grand experiment? Or did they quietly rewrite the rules? What if the celestial spark was never truly erased, but scattered forward into a new and far more difficult chapter of human history? One where an elevated thread of inheritance was woven through a secondary line of divinely chosen kings, demigods, and favored mortals, figures who continue to reshape the earth, destined to carry the secrets of the old world across oceans and eons. Because here's the thing, in those earliest days after the flood, civilization did not simply stumble back into existence. It rebuilt itself with remarkable speed across the fertile valleys of ancient Mesopotamia, establishing kingdoms and hierarchies that would rule for millennia before the rise of Greece, before Rome, before anything that most people today would recognize as ancient history. And though many look at this period as the age when the celestial secrets of the antediluvian world were finally lost, that reading doesn't hold up when you look closely at what the tablets actually say. The gods were still very much active. The highest earthly power was still concentrated in the hands of a select few, and those few were not chosen at random. Their bloodlines, their roles, and their authority reach back much further, to the very earliest foundations of Sumerian civilization, to figures whose actions would echo forward for centuries and rekindle the search for lost antediluvian wisdom across distant civilizations yet to come. What we're tracing here isn't the story of ordinary monarchs or the routine power struggles of societies entirely disconnected from the spiritual realm. It's something quieter and more extraordinary than that. It's the story of multiple distinct lines of a carefully preserved heritage, guided across the millennia to carry forward what the ancient texts describe as the supreme authority of the gods themselves. That's a bold claim, and it's one that the physical records, from clay tablets to royal inscriptions, king lists, and temple registries, actually give us something real to work with. So prepare yourself for the era we're entering, because here, the line between mortal reality and divine intervention was not blurred by accident. It was blurred by design. The oldest cuneiform records ever recovered make a declaration that surfaces again and again across different sites and different centuries, pointing all the while to certain figures in antiquity who were not regarded simply as powerful men. They occupied a space somewhere between historical reality and mythological exaltation. Demigods, semi-divine hybrid beings, mortals chosen and elevated by gods to guide all humanity through its earliest recorded dawn. And the social and spiritual hierarchy embedded in these texts is genuinely strange and genuinely fascinating, because it isn't presented as allegory, it's presented as administrative fact, as bureaucratic records set in stone, reflecting the breathtaking structure of a world where heaven and earth were inextricably bound to one another. And those records can be seen to this day, stored away in cool, dusty tablet rooms in the ruins of Nineveh, Uruk, and collections that were buried for thousands of years before 19th century excavators began pulling them out of the earth and shipping them to museums where scholars could finally begin the slow, difficult work of translating them. And among the most striking artifacts to emerge from that process is one you have likely already encountered: the Sumerian King List, a document that preserves a staggering and deeply strange record of royal succession, listing the kings who ruled before and after the Great Flood, along with the lengths of each of their reigns. And what it reveals is that the sacred authority of kingship, which had descended upon the first primeval cities of ancient Sumer, did not simply collapse when that era ended. It was established anew across the rising kingdoms of post-flood antiquity, city by city, dynasty by dynasty, in a pattern that reads less like ordinary political succession and more like a carefully administered inheritance. And beyond the king list, there are hundreds to thousands of temple registries and royal records from various cultures, tracking specialized advisors, high priests, and monarchs who claimed direct intellectual or genetic inheritance from the antediluvian world. These weren't fringe claims made by outsiders. They were inscribed by the very same institutions that held all the power as official records of legitimate authority. Inscribed in wet river clay thousands of years ago, these silent tablets preserve a trail of power that challenges everything we assumed about the origins of human civilization, the hierarchy of ancient societies, and the foundations of the beliefs that shaped everything to come. And then there are the biological anomalies. Because when you read the earliest post-flood dynasties in the Sumerian record, the reigns listed for the first few monarchs to reign after the Great Reset are not measured in years. They too are stretched across centuries, hundreds of years attributed to a single king before the next takes the throne, only to be shortened to normal time frames, no more than a few generations later. And this isn't unique to one document or one location. It appears consistently across multiple Sumerian sources in a pattern that gradually shifts over time, as the recorded lifespans slowly contract towards something approaching conventional standards. But whether you read this literally, or as a coded symbolic system for displaying political prestige, the question it raises is real. Why would a civilization that was otherwise meticulous and practical in its record-keeping consistently attribute multi-century reigns to its earliest post-flood rulers? What were they trying to preserve in that image? Then there are other figures who deserve more attention, one of whom claimed no noble lineage whatsoever, no bloodline connected to the primeval era, yet he quickly rose to reshape the ancient world in ways never seen before. through what the texts describe as the direct favor and love of a particular goddess. Stories like these don't fit the expected pattern, and that's exactly what makes them worth examining more closely. And then there are the kings whose historical reality is no longer seriously in question. Men whose footprints archaeologists can trace in the actual soil of Mesopotamia, confirmed through inscriptions, building projects, and direct records from their own lifetimes. Yet some of these same men took a step that no ordinary monarch would take. They placed a sacred symbol, a divine marker reserved exclusively for gods, directly before their own names in official texts, declaring themselves living deities on earth, not as metaphor, not as poetic flourish, but as a literal statement of status written into administrative documents, carved into monuments, repeated across centuries. To the people who lived through this, these were not mythic allegories. They were literal, historical anomalies, written into stone by the very men and women who were there to witness them. If you're listening to this in the quiet of the night, drop a comment below and let us know where you are and what time it is. There's something genuinely comforting about knowing that listeners scattered across distant lands and completely different time zones are all settling into the same quiet journey through the forgotten echoes of human history. And if this Sumerian history for sleep narrative is helping you relax or drift off, consider subscribing to the channel. It helps support our efforts to keep bringing you these ancient stories each week and continue reaching others who are searching for the same calm place to relax and unwind. If you would like uninterrupted sleep and longer versions, those are available to you through the Legends of the Dawn membership. Now, let the modern world soften and fall away. Watch as the noise and the light of the present dissolve slowly into something older. Mud brick towers rising against a copper sky, whitewashed temple walls catching the last of the evening heat. The city of Kish standing as the supreme seat of earthly power at the dawn of a new age, millennia before the modern world ever took its first breath. The cool night air carries the faint perfume of sun-baked silt, cedar smoke, and the sweetness of date palms swaying along the Euphrates. And somewhere in the hum of that ancient world, in the lamplight of a temple room, a scribe presses a reed into wet clay and begins recording the names of kings who claim more than mortal inheritance. Step backward into the silent mist of deep antiquity, where the very first great kingdom of the post-flood earth is about to rise, and humanity's place in the cosmic order is about to be renegotiated under a mandate older than any of us have been taught to remember. And all the while, the scribe keeps his long reed stylus flowing, pressing a record into clay that refuses to let Enlil's fury be the end of the story, because according to the Sumerian king list, it wasn't. After the waters pulled back and the silt settled, and the land re-emerged, something happened that the ancient scribes considered worth documenting with the same gravity as creation itself. Kingship descended from heaven a second time, not in Eridu, not in Shuruppak, not in any of the great antediluvian cities, whose names the list had carefully preserved. The second descent landed in Kish, a city that would become the defining symbol of post-flood authority for every Mesopotamian ruler who came after. When later kings wanted to assert that their power was legitimate, that it traced back to the very beginning of the New World, they claimed ties to Kish, because to hold Kish was to hold the mandate, and to hold the mandate was to claim an unbroken line reaching all the way back to the moment the gods decided to reinstitute order over the earth. Kish itself was no small city-state. Emerging from the alluvial plains between the Tigris and Euphrates, it was a sprawling mud brick city organized around temple complexes, and irrigation networks that fed thousands of people. And the Anunnaki, as the texts describe them, were not silent observers of this rebuilding. They reinstated governance here, deliberately, establishing a center from which human labor could be organized, canals managed, and the rhythms of temple worship maintained. There was a structure to all of it, intentional and divinely sanctioned. The city was less a settlement and more an instrument, placed precisely at the pivoting point between the old world and the new one. But the kings who first sat on that throne were not quite like the kings who would follow them. The Sumerian king list records the earliest rulers of post-flood Kish with lifespans that, though far shorter than their not-so-distant ancestors, still strain comprehension. Juka, the very first king of this new era, is credited with a reign of 1,200 years, the second, a king called Kulasina Baal, with 900. These extraordinary lifespans represent a fascinating transitional biological phase, the slow dilution of antediluvian physiology as pre-flood divine lineage mixed with mortals on Earth, a gradual dimming of the original celestial signal, century by century, generation by generation. But Juka was the king described as having descended directly from the heavens, in the same language the list used for the kings who ruled before the flood. He is credited with laying the foundational infrastructure of Kish, the canal systems and administrative architecture that made the city function at all. And then came Etana, the 13th king of Kish. He is described in the ancient texts as a shepherd chosen directly by the god Enlil to guide all the lands. But Etana had a problem. He had no male heir, no son to inherit the throne, no bloodline to carry the kingship forward after him. And in the cosmology of ancient Sumer, a dynasty without succession wasn't just a political crisis. It was a cosmic rupture. So Etana went looking for a solution in the only way the texts suggest was available to him. He appealed to the heavenly realm of the gods, praying to the sun god Shamash, who directed him to a remote mountain. And there, deep inside a pit, a great eagle lay broken. Its wings had been torn apart by a sacred serpent, punishment for betraying an oath the two creatures had sworn before the gods themselves. The eagle was trapped, starving, unable to fly. Etana found it there. He fed it meat and tended its wounds, sealing them closed with aromatic resins until its feathers grew back surely, but slowly. And when the eagle was healed, it offered him something in return. It would carry the king directly into the sky. What follows in the surviving fragments is one of the oldest recorded accounts of aerial ascent in human history, one rivaled only by King Emnidoranki's ascent in the antediluvian days of Sippar. Etana climbed onto the eagle's back and held tight to its neck as they rose above the low-laying lands of the earth, watching the landscape below shrink smaller and smaller until the sea looked like nothing more than a small blue marble, and the fields like a single garden carved into dust. Together they passed through the heavenly gates of Anu, then Enlil, then Enki, ascending through layers of the upper realms in search of the Shamu Shah Aladi, the plant of birth, the sacred celestial substance guarded within the halls of the gods themselves, a thing that could, the texts imply, do what no earthly remedy could accomplish: open the way for an heir. The surviving clay is damaged at the crucial moment. We don't know definitively whether Etana reached what he was seeking, but history remembers him as the shepherd who ascended to heaven and consolidated all the lands. That phrase suggests he came back with something, and the Sumerian king list records successors to his throne, which implies the bloodline did continue. What that story encodes is worth sitting with quietly for a moment, because it isn't simply a legend about a desperate king and a remarkable bird. It carries a theological argument embedded in the oldest written layer of Mesopotamian thought, that divine kingship was not purely a matter of biology or direct inheritance, that there were moments when the continuation of a sacred line required direct celestial intervention, a literal journey into the upper heavens, a divine catalyst retrieved from the halls of the gods and brought back down into the mortal world. Etana's ascent wasn't an aberration in the system. It was the system revealing its own architecture, that the most consequential royal bloodlines were never forged by human hands alone, but renewed and activated through direct contact with the highest reaches of cosmic authority. That architecture didn't collapse when the floodwaters finally receded. It continued, just through different vessels than before. And while the new kings were rising from Kish, moving their courts to Uruk, then onward to rebuilding the cities and re-establishing the sacred institutions of old, they weren't doing it entirely alone. All the while, there was another group of figures moving quietly alongside them, not kings themselves, but something older than kingship. Distant relatives of the original seven sages, the Apkallu, who had guided the great antediluvian capitals of ancient Sumer before the flood came. Those original seven were never seen walking the shores of Mesopotamia again. That much is clear from the texts. But their bloodline, their genetic inheritance, had not simply vanished into the mud. It had passed forward. It had survived, embedded in a new generation of hybrid beings who looked nothing like their half-fish, half-human ancestors, beings who carried no obvious sign of what they really were. 4 sages emerged into the post-flood world, recorded in the cuneiform tradition by name: Nungal Pirigaldem, Pirigolabsu, and Lunana, 4 figures who stood between the divine architecture of the old world and the purely mortal world slowly forming around them. What makes Lunana particularly striking is what the texts say about him directly, not through inference, not through metaphor, but in plain cuneiform description. He is defined as being only 2/3 Apkallu, and that matters more than it might seem on first hearing, because it means the scribes who recorded this weren't simply writing mythology in loose poetic terms. They were making a specific genetic claim, a statement of inheritance, clearly indicating that the divine sages who came before the flood had at some point mated with mortal women, and that their offspring carried forward a diluted but still potent version of that original celestial biology. 2/3, not fully divine, not fully human, something precisely in between, enough to carry the knowledge forward, enough to serve as an advisor to kings who had descended from heaven's second gift to the earth. And physically, these post-flood Apkallu are depicted far differently from their ancestors. Eagle-headed figures, warrior-like in their proportions, nothing like the fish-cloaked forms of the 7 who came before them. The divine instruction had found a new shape to move through. But shapes change, and bloodlines dilute. That's simply what happens across generations when the divine mixes repeatedly with the mortal. And so, as the centuries passed and the dynasties continued their slow succession from city to city, the active presence of the 4 post-flood Apkallu themselves began to quietly fade from the record, into something seemingly far more ordinary. Their hybrid descendants grew more human with every generation, until the point came when the sages advising the king were no longer described as Apkallu at all. They were called the Umanu, fully human scholars, scribes, and royal counselors who carried the ancient knowledge forward through sheer mastery of their intellectual inheritance, through study and transmission through the written word pressed into soft clay. They were still understood to be categorically above ordinary citizens, not just socially, but spiritually, legally designated as gatekeepers of divine knowledge, using celestial mathematics and ritual precision to determine the will of the gods for the empire. The shift from Apkallu to Umanu is one of the quietest transitions in the entire Mesopotamian record, and also one of the most significant. It's the moment when the direct biological chain from the gods finally completed its long arc into standardized human intelligence, when the wisdom became a discipline rather than a direct connection to the divine. But that connection still lived on, and it is reflected clearly in another figure who sits right at the edge of that transition. His name was Abanana, and he served as advisor to King Shulgi of one of the most powerful and deliberately self-mythologized rulers in all of Mesopotamian history. But Abanana was real. He appears in the historical record, and what he claimed about himself is the part worth looking at more closely. Because Abanana didn't simply present himself as a learned scholar or a capable court advisor. He claimed direct descent from the pre-flood Apkallu themselves, a living connection to the antediluvian sciences, to the knowledge that had existed before the waters came. Whether that claim was literal, symbolic, or political is a question the tablets don't fully answer. But the fact that such a claim could be made in a serious administrative context tells you something important about how that culture understood the relationship between ancient wisdom and legitimate authority. The bloodline to the old world wasn't just mythology. It was currency. It was status. It was the act of keeping the gods' wisdom alive, and it kept circulating long after anyone might have expected it to stop. Because the sages don't simply disappear when Mesopotamian civilization begins to fade. They reappear again and again, reshaped in later Jewish, Christian, and classical traditions, carrying entirely different names and presented with entirely different reputations. The wise civilizers who taught humanity agriculture, writing, and sacred law in the Sumerian texts become something far more troubling in later apocalyptic traditions. Scholars who have traced the structural parallel between the pre-flood Apkallu and the figures described in the Book of Enoch have noted a deliberate inversion. The same basic story, divine beings descending to instruct humanity before a great flood, but flipped in its moral perception. In the Sumerian record, the Apkallu are dedicated protectors and eternally wise teachers, gifts from the gods to help civilization take root. But in Enochic tradition, those same descending figures become the Watchers, rebellious heavenly beings whose hybrid offspring brought ruin and violence to the earth before the flood came to wash it clean. Even the terminology crosses over. Akkadian ritual texts describe buried protective figurines as masare, a word that translates directly as watchers, placed inside homes to ward off evil and guard the threshold, the same word. A completely different moral charge attached to it by the time it reaches Second Temple Jewish literature. What had once been a guardian became a corrupter, and what had once been deemed revered sacred knowledge became forbidden arts, lost for many ages in the sand-swept remnants of one of the world's oldest recorded civilizations, waiting for modern eyes to take a second look. And to really understand what happened to all of these figures, and to the knowledge they supposedly carried on long after the waters receded, because new seats of power had been created for a world that had been remade, not one that was forgotten, a world that defined their claim to power rather than being hidden from it. The governance structure that emerged in the post-flood era wasn't just about kings and armies, and at its center sat an institution that continued to claim a lineage older than the flood itself, long after we thought their wisdom had been lost. Remember the antediluvian priests of old, the Baru? Throughout most studies, they are most strongly associated with the antediluvian period. Specifically, their mythological origins under King Enmedaranki of Sippar, who was said to have received the arts of divination directly from the gods Shamash and Adad, but that connection between the Baru priesthood and the gods was not simply a founding legend told around fires in later years. It became a professional credential sustained across millennia of documented history. Excavations at Mari and Sippar have pulled clay models of divination rituals from the earth, inscribed tablets used like training manuals, teaching younger priests the precise techniques passed down through the guild. They were structured, technical, and fiercely methodical. And the moment you understand that, the true scope of what the Baru actually were begins to settle in differently. By the time of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, somewhere between 911 and 612 BCE, thousands of years after their original guilds in Sippar had been placed in ancient memory, the Baru had reached the absolute height of their political influence. In the courts of kings like Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal, royal Baru priests traveled side by side with some of the greatest armies of ancient antiquity. They examined sacrificial animals like divine omens before military campaigns began. They submitted written reports to the king, interpreting the appearance of eclipses, the paths of shooting stars, the behavior of weather systems. What the gods were saying through the sky was their department, and no serious decision moved without their reading of it. 100 tablets, thousands of conditional statements structured as if then observations used to decode the precise messages hidden in the natural world. And throughout all of it, their claimed antediluvian origin served as a kind of professional certification. The wisdom was flawless, they argued, because it had not originated with men. It had been given before the flood, preserved through the disaster, and physically buried in the archives of Sippar until it could be recovered and carried forward. But the Baru and the Ummanu were not the only post-flood institutions carrying this weight. When kingship descended again at Kish, a second structure emerged alongside the centralized supreme authority of the Lugal. These were the Ensi, local priest-kings governing individual city-states. Figures like the rulers of Lagash and Their high duties were directly aided by the Sabra, the temple administrator who managed the practical functions of the sacred space. Only the Ensi answered directly to a supreme Anunnaki god, but within their own cities they held enormous authority. And they were not selected the way an ordinary official would typically be appointed. Sumerian texts describe the Ensi as being called by name, directly by the city's patron deity. Enlil might choose one man from the population of a city. Inanna might designate another. This was not a matter of lineage alone, though lineage still mattered enormously. It was direct divine election, and the texts frame it as exactly that. Ensi rulers would claim that they had been nourished with sacred milk of the gods by divine goddesses, and that this had given them extraordinary physical stature, unusual wisdom, and a quality of leadership that set them apart from anyone born of purely mortal circumstance. Gudea of Lagash is perhaps the most well-documented example of what this could eventually mean, because after his death, Gudea was actually given a form of minor divine status. His people offered sacrifices to him and directed prayers toward his memory, treating him not as a departed ruler, but as something closer to a local deity. The boundary between mortal and divine beings was, it seems, considered crossable under the right conditions. And then there is Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon of Akkad, appointed high priestess of the moon god Nanna at She is among the earliest named authors in recorded human history, and her hymns, particularly the exaltation of Inanna, reshaped the theological landscape of Mesopotamia in ways that scholars are still tracing today. She was not simply a woman in a religious role. Hers was one that carried enormous institutional power, and it was not accidental. It was carefully curated. This can't all just be mere coincidence, as many mainstream theories would like to maintain, because through these records, time and time again, we witness divine intervention directly from the Anunnaki, long after the floodwaters receded. And what you see across all of these figures and all of these institutions is a pattern, a deliberate, carefully maintained architecture of divine connection, extended across centuries. The flood did not erase the old order, it simply reorganized it, and those who carried the threads of antediluvian knowledge forward, whether through priestly lineage, divine election, or through the literal burial and recovery of sacred texts, they continued to shape the world in ways we still don't fully understand, carrying the torch of antiquity forward to new and brighter horizons. But believe it or not, that's not even the half of it, because from the early Sumerian city-states to their expansion across Acadia, Babylon, and Assyria, we also witness something far more direct. Not the quiet nudge of indirect aid, not the slow transmission of priestly knowledge, but the gods leaving their impression in something far more intimate, in the blood itself, in our very own DNA, spawning some of the most remarkable figures in all of early human history, rulers who weren't merely chosen, rulers who were, by the reckoning of their own people and their own records, something other than fully human. And what makes this genuinely difficult to dismiss is that these aren't figures from obscure corners of mythology. They hold a very real place in the historical record, which raises a question worth sitting with. If the texts we have are any indication at all, how far did those bloodlines actually run? We'll start with Enmerkar, the legendary founder of Uruk, one of the great early cities of Mesopotamia, who appears in the epic poetry of his era, not as a man who seized power, but as a man who was directly selected for it. In the poem known as Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta, he is described explicitly as the Lord chosen by Inanna in her holy heart, not metaphorically chosen, not symbolically anointed, chosen in the language of the text, and not for any ordinary reason. Because Enmerkar claimed a far more direct celestial lineage, he was said to be the literal son of Shamash, also known as Utu, the sun god. And here, his claim to rule Uruk rested not on military conquest or inherited wealth, but on a direct and personal relationship with the divine. The city was his because the goddess had looked into her heart and placed him there. That kind of language wasn't rhetorical flourish in Sumerian writing. It was a theological statement, meant to be understood exactly as written. Then there is Gilgamesh, the fifth king of the first dynasty of Uruk, and one of the most well-studied legendary figures in all of ancient literature. His own texts describe him as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a measurement worth pausing on because it mirrors almost exactly the hybrid proportions attributed to the post-flood Apkallu Sages. A surviving strain, perhaps, of the physiology that existed before the flood reshaped the world, a physiology clearly reflected in his tremendous stature. Interestingly enough, the ancients took meticulous care in recording his physical size and strength, and by any standard he is described in terms that suggest something far older than ordinary human inheritance, putting him at 11 cubits tall, which in our measurements equates to roughly 16 to 19 feet, or 4.9 to 5.8 meters tall, with a chest 4 cubits wide. The texts describe Gilgamesh as being perfect in strength, possessing raw superhuman power that allowed him to outmatch nearly any opponent. In his famous battle with Enkidu, they grappled so violently that the walls of Uruk were said to shake, the doorposts shattered. Still, Gilgamesh ultimately overpowered him. He wrestled and slaughtered the divine bull of heaven by grabbing it by its horns and thrusting a sword directly into its neck, a beast so massive that its snorts opened cracks in the earth that swallowed hundreds of men. He also fought and killed Humbaba, the terrifying supernatural guardian of the cedar forest, and in some versions of that myth, the sheer force of their battle flattened whole mountains. And at the heart of it all was his quest for antediluvian wisdom. His epic journey to find Utnapishtim, the flood hero, also known as Ziusudra, who was granted eternal life by the gods, was not a spiritual allegory in the way we might read it today. It was a search for the actual secrets of the world before the deluge, for knowledge that had been lost when the flood reorganized everything. And his later connection to the Nephilim tradition, the biblical figures described as the offspring of divine beings and human women, is noted by scholars who trace these parallel narratives across Sumerian, Babylonian, and Hebrew sources. The thread connecting them is consistent, and with it, so is the idea that certain individuals carried something far more ancient in their lineage. But the pattern doesn't stop with legendary kings. It extends forward into firmly historical rulers, who made their divine status an official matter of record. The cuneiform sign known as the dingir, a star symbol used strictly to denote a deity in Mesopotamian writing, was placed before the names of several historical rulers, not as a poetic honor, but as a formal designation. Among the most notable is Shulgi of who claimed to be the literal brother of Gilgamesh and the direct son of the goddess Ninsun. He didn't simply rule. He established active cult temples dedicated to his own living worship, and his reign was one of extraordinary achievement. He unified weights and measures across Mesopotamia, standardized a state calendar, rebuilt and extended road systems, and created way stations for travelers along major routes. He completed the great ziggurat of the massive stepped temple his father Urnemu had begun, raising it to its finished form. He also poured enormous energy into the scribal schools of the Edubba, revitalizing their curriculum and driving a period of literary preservation and literacy that historians now call the Sumerian Renaissance. A man who claimed to be divine and then spent his reign building the kinds of institutions that last for centuries. Naram Sin of Akkad took that declaration even further. After a string of military victories that pushed his empire to its greatest extent, stretching from what is now Turkey and the Mediterranean coast, all the way down through Iran and toward the Persian Gulf, he formally declared himself the living god of his city, depicting himself in royal motifs wearing the horned helmet, the same helmet that Mesopotamian iconography reserved strictly for divine beings. And the victory stele of Naram-Sin, one of the surviving masterpieces of ancient sculpture, shows him crowned with those horns, scaling a mountain above his defeated enemies. It is both a military monument and a theological statement carved in stone. His grandfather, though, is perhaps an even stranger figure in the record. Sargon of Akkad founded the Akkadian Empire around 2350 BCE, and it stands as the first true multi-nation empire in recorded history. He unified the southern city-states of Mesopotamia, establishing Akkadian as the dominant regional language and building a political structure that had simply never existed before. Not at that scale. But unlike most traditional dynastic rulers of his era, Sargon did not begin with divine blood. His birth legend, preserved in texts that scholars have compared directly to the later story of Moses, describes a child born in secret to a high priestess, sealed into a basket of reeds with bitumen to waterproof it, and set adrift on the steady currents of the Euphrates River. He was then pulled from the water by a humble gardener named Akki, who raised him as his own. He grew up working as a cupbearer in a royal court, not as a prince. And yet the goddess Ishtar, the texts say, loved him. That divine attention transformed everything. His rise to power was not legitimized by lineage. It was legitimized by direct favor from one of the most powerful female figures in the entire Sumerian pantheon. His established title of Shah-Ru-Kin translates to something close to true king, or legitimate king, a name that, in itself, acknowledged the unconventional nature of his claim. In Sargon's own official inscriptions, he described himself as the overseer of Inanna, the anointed of Anu, and the governor of Enlil, a man who may not have been born of direct divine inheritance by any measurable degree, but who had been personally selected by gods whose authority over earthly affairs never waned, even in the long years to come. And then there are the mysteries of Babylon, a settlement that began as little more than a minor town in what is now modern Iraq. But Babylon would quickly grow into something far larger, under a king named Hammurabi, who rose to power around 1792 BCE. He inherited a fragmented region, still recovering from the collapse of the third dynasty of Ur. And what he built from that inheritance was one of the ancient world's most unified empires. The Assyrian shadow was already spreading across the north at the same time, yet Babylon held and grew and eventually came to define a whole era of Mesopotamian civilization. And right at the center of that era, there is an artifact that tells us something important, not just about law, but about who these people believed was really in charge. There, we discovered the Code of Hammurabi, composed around 1754 BCE. It is carved onto a basalt stone pillar that stands nearly 7 feet tall. You heard that right, 7 feet, and inscribed on the surface are around 282 distinct laws covering nearly every level of society and organized life, trade and wages, marriages and divorce, theft and punishment, the treatment of slaves, the rights of free citizens, the responsibilities of builders, doctors, and merchants. Punishments shifted depending on your position in society, with harsher consequences applied differently across the elite, the free, and the enslaved. It also established something like a minimum wage for various forms of skilled labor. For its time, it was one of the most detailed and far-reaching legal frameworks the ancient world had ever produced. But the way it came to exist, that part is even more striking than the laws themselves, because Hammurabi never presented the code as his own creation, a distinction that matters enormously because it reveals exactly how power was understood in this corner of the world, and how deeply the older threads of Sumerian belief were still running through Babylonian culture. Rather than claiming personal credit, Hammurabi thought of himself as an instrument, the designated agent of a cosmic plan that had already been set in motion long before he was born. The stone pillar opens with a mythological prologue written in his own words, and those words make the chain of authority unmistakably clear. The great gods Anu and Enlil, the sky god, father of all the Anunnaki and the god of wind and earth, had chosen the city of Babylon to be the ruling center of the world. They had called upon Hammurabi specifically and by name to carry that mandate forward. His task was to bring order to the land, destroy wickedness, and protect the weak from being taken advantage of by those with more power. And at the very top of that pillar, carved into the basalt itself, is a scene that would have been immediately legible to anyone who looked at it. Hammurabi stands before Shamash, also known in the older Sumerian tradition as Utu, the god of the sun and of justice. Shamash is depicted wearing a horned crown, with rays of light rising from his shoulders. He is handing the king a measuring rod and a length of rope. Seemingly simple at first glance, until you realize that both of these are ancient symbols of divine order, the right to build and to judge. The message of that carving was direct. These laws were not invented by a mortal ruler sitting at a desk. They were cosmic truths handed down from heaven itself. To violate one was not simply to break a civic rule. It was to offend the very gods who authored it, showing that the old structure, the one written into the tablets long before Hammurabi was born, was still fully intact. And those patterns don't stay confined just to Mesopotamia. They echo outward into Egypt, into the mythological record of the biblical traditions, and beyond. And in both cases, they point back toward the same underlying obsession, the search for wisdom that survived the flood. Knowledge that predated and contained within it every ounce of information needed to fully restore the order of the world. In Egypt, there is the story of a man named Dedi. He appears in a text from the Old Kingdom period, described as a magician of sorts who had reached the age of 110 years. Pharaoh Khufu sought him out specifically because Dedi was said to know the location of the secret chambers of the sanctuary of Thoth, the god of writing and hidden knowledge. Those chambers, according to the story, held the instructions Khufu needed to construct his monuments at Giza, blueprints to the kind of engineering feats accomplished long before their empires were even thought of, indicating that even the design of the Great Pyramids was not invented by engineers working under the pharaoh. It was recovered. Retrieved from a repository of pre-flood knowledge that had been deliberately concealed and preserved across an enormous span of time, carried on by the kings, by the long lines of hybrid sages, priests, and seers, by the direct descendants of the gods themselves and those who somehow obtained their favor. And whether or not you take that story literally, the cultural logic behind it is consistent with everything we've been tracing. The most important knowledge, the most advanced wisdom one could ever hope to obtain, was antediluvian. The goal was always to reach back past the flood and recover what had been there before. A search that continues, even to this day. Then there is the figure of Nimrod. He appears in Genesis as a mighty hunter, a man of exceptional power who founded the cities of Babel and Nineveh in the land later associated with Assyria. Scholars have spent considerable effort tracing where that figure came from, and the most widely supported connection leads to Ninurta, the Sumerian god of war, agriculture, sacred law, and hunting. The linguistic shift from Ninurta to Nimrod is phonetically gradual enough to be more than credible. And the ruins of a major city known as Kalhu, which bore the name Nimrud in later periods, sat at the heart of Assyrian territory as a cult center specifically dedicated to Ninurta. Here the geography and the mythology collapse into each other. What the biblical tradition preserved as a legendary post-flood king building empires in the east, appears to be a layered reflection of the very same priest-king archetypes that ran through Kish and Uruk, a hunter king, a city founder, a figure whose authority over the earth descended in some form from above, just like so many of them did. And so the story settles, the way all old stories eventually do, into something quieter than the events themselves. Picture the last light of day pulling away from the southern plains of Mesopotamia. The whitewashed walls of the ziggurats catch it for a moment, burning pale gold against a sky that deepens from amber into something richer, something the color of old copper, then indigo, then the deep and eternal blue of night. Down along the Euphrates, where the reeds grow thick and the water moves slowly, small fires begin to glow in open courtyards. The smoke rises straight up in the still air. The day's noise softens, and in city after city, from the sandy southern shores near the Persian Gulf to the folded ridges of the Zagros Mountains in the east, then northwest into the plains of Mari and the upper reaches of Syria out along the Levantine coast, and down to the very borders of Egypt, the same quiet descends. The same stars emerge. The same ancient sky spreads itself above all of it, unchanged and as unhurried as it always has been. And somewhere in the darkness of one of those early cities, in the Edubba tablet houses, rows of clay tablets rest in the cool air. They have been drying slowly the way clay does, holding everything inside them, the sacred names, the genealogies that stretched back to a time before recorded history, the star coordinates pressed in careful wedge marks by steady hands working in lamplight. Those tablets don't need anyone watching them. They simply hold what they hold, patient and still and certain, the way only something that carries the full weight of antiquity can be, celestial knowledge sealed in earthen forms, curing gently in the dark, and life goes on around them, just as it always has. The generations keep coming. Cities grow beyond what their founders imagined. Astronomers chart the movements of planets across centuries of careful records. Builders raise structures that take lifetimes to complete. Children are born into families that carry old names without quite knowing why those names feel important. The thread keeps moving forward, quiet and unbroken, even when no one is watching it closely enough to see. The gods, if they were ever watching, grow more distant with each passing century. Or maybe they don't. Maybe they simply become harder to distinguish from the sky itself, from the long sweep of seasons, from the way certain ideas keep returning to human minds in different places and different eras, as though something is still passing them forward. They wait in the stars, in the quiet underlying knowledge written inherently into all things. And all the while, the mortals of the earthly realm continue doing what mortals have always done. They gaze upward, they wonder, and they build higher. There's something deeply restful in that image if you let yourself sit with it. All those generations, all that time, the same night sky looking down on the first cities and on every civilization that came after them, even on this very moment, right now. The river still moves in the same direction it always has. The stars still rise and set in their old familiar patterns. And somewhere underneath all of it, running like a slow current through everything, is the accumulated weight of that much human memory, that much time, that much quiet continuation. It doesn't ask anything of you, it just keeps flowing. And if you let your thoughts grow soft around the edges and focus more on the space between, you might feel it, that slow and golden current, ancient and warm and completely without urgency, carrying you unhurried, somewhere without boundaries or questions or the need to know what comes next, just the drifting itself. Through the deep celestial seas of the old world, in the feeling of being held by something much older and much larger than any single night. Let it take you. There's nothing left to figure out. Just the quiet. Just the stars, just the endless procession of the stars in the sky, held for eternity by the very intelligence from which they were first formed. The soft darkness stretches out over the ancient world, cradling the quiet lands in a peaceful embrace. Everything settles into a deep, soothing stillness. The distant outlines of quiet palm groves fade slowly into the dark shadows of the night. Cool air rests gently upon the sun-baked soil, bringing a calm and peaceful stillness to the sleeping earth. And all the while, the steady quiet rhythm of the rivers flow onward, moving smoothly under the velvet canopy of space. A gentle breeze gliding across their steady waters, whispering through the tall river reeds. The night deepens, and the bright starlight forms subtle patterns in the tapestry above, mirroring the tranquil current of the fluid currents below, winding together through the dark as one. You can feel the quiet warmth of the landscape held softly within this ancient world. The horizon softens, blending heaven and earth into one seamless expanse, and somewhere in that serenity, time itself seems to slow down and dissolve into the silent expanse of space, where those distant embers continue their silent journey, tracing light across the sky. Their glowing paths offer a gentle sanctuary, wrapping the earth in soft, soothing tranquility. Drifting deeper into this peaceful landscape, the mind gently untethers and rests. The quiet beauty of the sky cradles every thought, letting them float away like soft leaves on a dark river. Every turn of the celestial sphere invites a deeper sense of peaceful and untroubled rest, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the ancient night.